Hi, I'm Brett Erwin.
Hi, I'm Kelsie Foltz.
And I'm Jauron, and we're going to talk about food waste in the agricultural industry due to COVID-19 impacts. So the agricultural industry is very complex. There's a lot of moving parts and figures. There's suppliers, growers, middlemen, and intermediaries, and then there's the places that the products actually go. And there's a domino effect present when one stage of that gets disrupted, the entire industry kind of collapses. And one of the biggest disruptions in recent time, the COVID-19 crisis, had a large, massive impact on the agricultural industry. And this happened not because like the virus itself was impacting crops, but because of the demand shock that it created. So because of the lockdowns that governors created to stifle the virus, there were many institutions, schools, churches, and prison systems that had to close down and shut off production and shut down operations. And because of this, they had a lot less demand for fresh produce. And this happened at a really bad time when milk and onions and other produce specifically were at their peak growing and harvesting season, where farmers were stuck with large supplies of their perishable inventories like milk that were very time sensitive and go bad quickly, the definition of perishable, and they had a lot less demand for it. And so they had no way to store some of these products like milk that will go bad quickly. And therefore they had too much, and they were unprepared for this crisis to occur and had nothing to do to stop production. And the result is that millions of pounds of onions, thousands of gallons of fresh milk, any other product too had massive declines. And some farmers had to change their usual farming methods to shut down because it wasn't economical for them to grow or produce anything anymore. There was also a demand shock because of the loss of jobs that people had, because it impacted the economy as a whole. Less people being able to afford fresh groceries enabled people to want to get more processed and prepackaged items that farms aren't exactly adept for. And some farmers tried to address this by giving away extra products to like certain charities and institutions, but because of the lack of storage facilities for cold and transportation, this was just ineffective. And the larger companies that relied on farmers, and such as grocery stores and restaurants, are very important to the industry, but because they were shut down and had limited operations, it was just a big hit. And now Brett is going to talk about some of the class impacts, class connections.
Yeah, so in any operations management scenario, the goal is to ultimately efficiently produce goods and or services to the consumer on the most efficient process possible. Unfortunately for American farmers, this has clearly been an issue throughout the course of the pandemic, and it's led to a lot of wasted time of a resource. And wasted time of a resource can come from overproduction, transportation, rework, overprocessing, motion, inventory, and waiting. But the main focus here with this issue is going to be inventory and overproduction. And inventory actually comes as a result of overproduction, that we see more production is being used than the demand required. So just-in-time production, or JIT production, would ultimately help resolve this issue. Unfortunately, in this farming scenario, it's just not really realistic. What JIT production would do would allow the farmers to provide the perfect amount of crop or dairy products, exactly what is demanded. But as Dairy West farmer and community relations manager Lacey Papa George says, that if a regularly milked cow went too long without being milked, could result in injury, sickness, and sometimes even death if they were to be milked off schedule, went too long without it. And Otilia Beer, a master gardener, tells us that it takes 4 months for a potato to fully grow. So these clearly aren't things that can just on the spot be given to a consumer. I want a potato. It doesn't work like that. It's going to take them 4 months to grow one fully. So for these reasons, we see directly that this is a low agility in the farming industry. I don't have a lot of ability to adapt with the times. And this is one of the 3 traits on any supply chain that creates a sustainable competitive advantage. So this is something we're seeing the farmers lack right now in today's landscape. Additionally, this relates directly to the concept of utilization, which can be defined as flow rate divided by production capacity. And that term flow rate is the minimum between consumer demand and production capacity. So as Drew mentioned, due to a lot of the shutdowns and just the economy being on a different level, the demand is not where it used to be for dairy products and fresh produce. And this is leading to a lower demand, which leads to a lower flow rate, which ultimately leads to a low utilization or underutilization in this industry, with the demand so historically low. And then this kind of just comes full circle once again to why the inventory is so substantial, the inventory levels, which is not cheap, and it turns into waste. But now Kelsie will talk a little bit more about inventory and some ways to maybe resolve some of these conflicts.
Yeah, so as Brett was talking about, holding inventory can obviously be really expensive. There are storage costs that are associated, especially with the extreme amounts of products that are being stored right now. And there's also spoilage costs because these products are deteriorating and just completely going to waste and not being used at all for any value because they are going bad while waiting. Something that we learned in class was to let the demand drive the process. In other words, to go lean smartly. So by allowing the demand to drive the process, overproductions of these products can be minimized. The process should be run equivalent to takt time, which is also the same as cycle time in this case, because the process is not capacity constrained. And we know that when the cycle time increases, the utilization of the capacity will also increase. So some ways that we can go lean, going lean with the amount of produce and dairy that are being produced and stored, producers can actually save both their crops from being destroyed and save money on storage and spoilage costs. In order to go lean, there are usually 5 steps, and mapping out the process flow is one of them. You can see on the example on the left, we chose the milk processing flow example. The next step is probably the most important in our specific scenario because there are a lot of sources of waste capacity, such as the overproduction of dairy products in our case. The next step is to eliminate barriers to flow, standardize work procedures, and again, another really important one for us is to balance the resources in our process. By balancing the resources in the process, there will be a decrease in inventory waste, and because of line balancing, standardizing production, it's easier to avoid a surplus of inventory and buildups. The effects of the pandemic on the agriculture industry overall just made demand really low. And it's important for processors to adjust their operations levels to this new demand. And we know that obviously it's easy to suggest these kind of improvements for the agricultural industry, but the reality is that much of the production methods have historically been long running and inflexible and difficult to change overall. You know, you can't just produce an onion out of nowhere. It takes time. Milking cows, you can't just stop milking them. So while many of these improvements can be made to the agricultural industry through lean production methods, most of these procedures are going to need to be creative solutions and new ways in general to just help the agricultural supply chain be more resilient and respond to these demand shocks.
All right, thank you for watching our presentation.
Thank you.